Kia ora koutou. We'll get started. Thank you all for coming along to this Department of Public Health Friday seminar. The seminar is being recorded, so for those of you who've got colleagues who can't make it today, they can watch it online, recorded afterwards. We're talking about 2018 census today. Many of you will have seen news over the last year about the low response rates in the most recent census compared to previous censuses. And in the last year, Stats New Zealand methodology teams have been working really hard to try and understand what's going on with that undercoverage and fill in some of the gaps. And the first census results, many of you will have seen, were released earlier this week, along with a report from the Census External Data Quality Panel, which is an interesting read if you want to go and have a look. So many of us use census data for our work, and given the fairly high level of non-response in the 2018 census, and as a result, the sort of methods that have been used to create the census file, which are a bit different to what's been done previously, I think it's really important that all of us understand what's been done with the census data and how that might affect the work that we do with it. So to that end, today we've got Vince Galvin from Statistics New Zealand speaking to us. Vince is the Chief Methodologist at Stats New Zealand, and he's been overseeing the units that are leading the methodological work to create the 2018 census file. Vince has been around for a long time. He has a long history at Stats New Zealand, and he's been working in the New Zealand statistical system for 30 years. He's worked with other national statistical organisations as well in the UK and in Australia. So he's seen a lot of censuses, but probably not going too much out on a limb to say that this most recent one has been one of the most challenging for many people at Stats. So today Vince is going to talk to us about the construction of the 2018 census file. Vince, welcome. Thank you so much for coming out here, and I will hand over to you.
Okay, thank you, Sheree. That was such a comprehensive introduction. I feel like I can sort of skip the first half a dozen slides, which will be good, because so I just explained that what I'm doing is a sort of an updated, modified version of the stump speech I've been been giving a number of times. So, and I'll move through it reasonably quickly, but it varies. Do feel free to stop me if I've glossed over something that is the one thing you came to know. So do feel free to shout out. Now, this is where, okay, so this is roughly what we're going to do. Just a little bit of where we're up to. I'm going to spend most of the time talking about the methods and the impact that the methods had. And we'll just do a little bit at the end about what comes next, and possibly talk about the two. I don't have much information in this talk about the review of the management and governance of the process, which is what actually went wrong. So I'm happy to talk about that, but I'm not going to talk about that in the slides. And I haven't attempted in any real detail to, any detail at all, to summarise the external data quality panel report. So I can answer questions about it, but as I say, both those reports, of course, you can go and read them on the website, so they're there to see. Okay, so Sheree said, we released the report on Monday. Essentially, we're able to provide the information needed for the electoral system, a few key variables, and with the interim report of the External Data Quality Panel, I'll summarise that a little bit later on. Things still to come. There's the variables, the full range of variables. There's about 60 variables on the census file, and we've probably released about half a dozen. And we've got the post-enumeration survey, which is where we actually officially measure the coverage of the census. Okay, so I've just got a few slides now that are about terminology. So this is, some people laughed when I with the slides, but so we attempted to put in place a full field enumeration census. Lots of countries, particularly Scandinavian countries, have only use administrative data. That's the way they compile their census. And this terminology, combined census using a mix of admin sources and field collection, is a United Nations term. There's a United Nations Census Manual which uses this word. So we've started using this in describing what we've done this time. And people, but it's not a word we made up. It came from a United Nations standard United Nations set of terminology. Okay, so this is I'm expecting that I'm talking to a pretty technical audience, so I'm moving through these first ones pretty quickly. This is just to make the point that obviously we always have some sort of undercount in the census. We've been measuring, having post-enumeration surveys since the 1996 census, and that the count that we do achieve as published has always contained some records that we generated by different methods that allowed non-responses. So there's always been the actual forms and forms that have been generated as part of our non-response mitigation. And just to make that totally explicit, so if you look at the 2013 data set, we imputed a lot of whole records. And imputed in this context means we use something like a nearest neighbour technique. So we had a lot of field enumerators went out. We didn't get a response from a household. They looked at the household. There was a beautifully cut lawn and dishes on the sink. And they said this household was occupied. And so we used some sort of a nearest neighbour method to pick another record in the census file to use to substitute, effectively we called them substitutes. There are 135,000 of those in the 2013 census. And there's been, and if you want to say, well, how do I find out about all that? You can read the last post-enumeration survey report that's on the website. It gives you the history of how many records have been imputed and how we've allowed for non-response in different ways in previous censuses. We have done something different this time. So we haven't duplicated records. What we did, and this is what I'm going to talk about, we did two things, but we've used a lot of administrative data. And essentially most of what I'm going to talk about to you today is where did the administrative data come from? How did we decide how to make use of the administrative data we had and what impact it had? But what we didn't do this time, so there was no records in the file this time that are duplicated responses. We've abandoned that approach because we feel that and essentially I'll be talking to you about the fact that the administrative records are so good now that they provide information on an actual respondent. Okay, so we're coming to the end of the terminology. So now, as I said, how we look at the quality of a census officially at the end is the post-enumeration survey. We have not completed that process so far, so I'm going to be making a series of statements about the coverage as we understand it currently with the file we've just produced. What am I comparing the census file to? So we've got two things that we've done to do that. We're always publishing an ERP, stands from an estimated resident population, _ 2013 means based on the 2013 census. So I imagine most of you will be familiar with this idea. We start with the rebase every time we do a census, add births, deaths, net migration, and that's how we get our estimated resident population. The other thing that's circled there is a DSE, dual system estimation. So what we've done there is applied essentially a capture-recapture methodology using the 2018 census file as one capture of the population and our administrative data set, which I'll be talking about in a minute, which is our best estimate of the population, and used a capture-recapture methodology to estimate the size of the population. And as you can see, they line up fairly well with each other. So I'll be using one or the other as the point of comparison most of the way through this Okay, so here we go. This is the what actually happened in the census and what the file now contains. Excuse me. Okay, so the only distinction to make here is that I've cut down the forms received into two categories. First of all was when we received an individual form, and secondly, where all we knew about someone was they were recorded on the household form. So when they're recorded on the household form, we get a limited range of variables from them. This is age, their relationship to the person filling in the form. Obviously, it's from the household, so we know the address. As you can see, that 203,000 is high by historical standards. In the 2013 census, there was 68,000 in that category. However, as you can see, the main feature of this file, and what I'll be talking to you a lot for the rest of the talk, is that we've added in about 520,000 administrative records into the file. And that's what I'll be talking to you how we got there. So you can see that compared to the best estimate of the population, we think that we're 69,000 short of the best estimate of the population, and I'll be talking to you a little bit more about what we think we know about that as we get through. Okay, so 2 slides now just about coverage rate. So this is what we've talked about, the coverage rate. So this is after we've added in the administrative data, what we think the coverage rates are for subpopulations and the national rate. So compared to what we've thought our coverage rates have been before, this is a pretty tight distribution. But of course, this is after adding in the administrative data. Before adding in the administrative data, now I don't know, oh, that's no, you can see that, can't you? It's not so good for me on the screen here, the smaller writing, but so so you would have heard these numbers covered in the media maybe, but it's so there's 2 ways of calculating the response rate. We've our traditional way, which is very scrupulous by international standards, where we effectively only count a completed individual form, and the other way, which is the middle group there, where if we've got sufficient information supplied on the household form, you count them as a response. So we are being, the higher number is more consistent with the way that internationally response was calculated, but we're presenting both every time we talk about response rates, just so, because there was some concern that we were changing the rules and cooking the books and whatnot. But however, the material message is fairly plain, that we did very badly with Maori and Pacific in terms of obtaining responses, and these are low response rates by historical standards. Okay, so now I'm going to go on to telling you where the administrative data came from and how we've used it to create the census file. Now, I'm wary that many of you a lot of you are probably very familiar with the IDI, so I wasn't going to dwell too long on this slide. The essential features of the IDI from this perspective is that we build what's circled on the right of the screen that you're looking at, a spine, which is an ever-resident population concept. We used as few sources as we can that have higher sources, the highest coverage that we can find. Obviously, the more sources you use, the more you have to worry about the overlap problems and making sure you've eliminated duplications and so forth. So we build the spine. There's something like 10 million people in the spine. As I say, it's an ever-resident population concept. And then essentially we attach data from all the other data sources and agencies to the spine. So we find ways of linking into the spine. As I say, there's no unique ID numbers in New Zealand, so that's done on various forms of statistical matching, which I won't dwell on here. And then what we do is take that, the wider population, and reduce it to a population that's mimics the population we're looking for, the New Zealand resident population. So that essentially that's done by having a counting rule that includes all individuals who've had activity in some administrative data sources in the 2 years before the census, and we're able to take out people who've died and people who have left the country before the census date. So the data we have allows that to be identified at the individual levels. And we create something called we call the IDI-IRP. So you can tell that we have absolutely no talent for marketing, because if you were going to take something that mattered that much to you, you wouldn't give it a clumsy, horrible name like that. But there we go. So that means the estimated resident population unit record file based on the IDI. So that's how it gets that name. Now, this is not a new thing for Statistics New Zealand. So we've been doing, we started this work something like 2012. We've been looking at individual variables and how to mimic the population, the unit record files themselves. We released a unit record file that did the age, sex distribution in 2016, as you can see there, added geographies in 2017 and ethnicity in 2018. So this is, we've built quite an understanding of how, what the strengths and limitations are at monitoring the population using administrative data. And there's a couple of just snapshots from reports. So there's an extensive series of reports on our website. There's about 15 separate papers that describe various aspects of this work and where it's got to over the time it's been done. So, we're not pretending that it's a silver bullet. So so what I've done here is highlighted some of the key limitations that we've learned as we've gone through this work. That often some of the totals we looked at, those graphs that were on the previous slide, show close alignment, but we think there's under coverage and over coverage going on. We've had some clues about that. Very hard to capture younger adults, especially males, well, and that comes through in all the work. The geographic location is good for larger geographies, but as you work down and get more granular, the quality deteriorates. And it's hard to form households with administrative data. It turns out that with the exception of working for families and the trivial case of people who live alone, that most of New Zealand's programs are individual entitlement based. So there's no need for the agencies administering the programs to collect family structure. So essentially we have to build families by getting everybody's address right, and that has its own difficulties. So, but basically we knew about these, that they were well aware of them, and the way we've added them to the census file, we've done it with these limitations in mind. Okay, so, oh, well, that's not very informative, is it? There we go. Well, let's put this on the screen. So what I'm going to do now, this is just talking through it. Obviously, we've got, you're not going, we don't have the time to describe the methods and details. What I should have said is that, which on Monday, when we released the estimates, we also released about 7 methods papers which describe what I'm doing, what I'm talking about here at the top level. There's a lot of detail provided in those methods papers that are on the website. Anyway, I'll just talk you through how it works. So so I'm sure this is no surprise to any of you that this is just a way of presenting a data set. This is the census file. Down the vertical axis, we've got individuals. Across the horizontal axis is variables. The little bit there, the little sliver, is the household listing files I was talking about before, where we have a small number of variables. And the light grey area is people we didn't get. So that's what the census file looks like. This is what the administrative data, the IDI IRP file looks like. It's skinnier, we have less variables, and I'll talk a little bit more about sourcing variables from administrative data and other sources a bit later. It's about the right length, we think, but both of them, the little white squares, there are gaps in both of them, item non-response of different sorts. So that's what the significance of the little white squares. So essentially, we match the two files together, and we look at the group of people that are in the administrative data set, but not on the census file, and we look to them and make decisions about how to treat them. So, so I'll just work through that process a little more. So essentially, as we take this group of people, and then we go through 5 steps, and 3 steps include people, and 2 steps delete people. So I'll just work through that sort of quickly, so you get an idea for what's going on. So the first thing that we can do is, on the individual file, people give us clues about who they live with. So the most common one here was somebody says, I live in my house with my baby. And we look at the house and we have one form. We go into the administrative records and find the birth record for the child. And what other information exists there, we add in the child. So that's a fairly concrete sort of thing. You'll see how large the group of people that is. But that's the most specific and concrete one that we do. Oh, here we go. There's a lot of things happening. So the second one was, we invested quite a bit in the dwelling frame this time. So essentially, we think we've got a good list that was, and part of the process of the census was to verify the dwelling frame with a whole lot of on-the-ground inspection before we started the census process. And where we think it's we look at the dwelling frame and we look at our administrative data, and we use a series of, essentially it's a series of regression equations and set of models and a method developed by the US Bureau of the Census in their pilot that they've been running for their next census, to identify where we will pick up a household of administrative data and put it into the dwelling frame where we didn't get a response. So we've got criteria for that matching, basically comes down to where the fit is good enough. There's another set of records where we are not confident we can add them into a household confidently, but we've been through a process of assuring ourselves that they should be in the population, and that looking at people of similar categories in our data set, we can fit a model to get them into the right mesh block. So there's a group of records that we've added into a mesh block, and given everybody put them in the same point, the same site within a mesh block. So they'll appear and be counted in the mesh block files, but they won't be given a household as such. Okay, so those are the 3 steps that included people. There's 2 sets that are deletion steps. The first one is that, as I said, we're concerned about the possibility of overcoverage. So after we did the linking, we then went back to the tests that we applied to the administrative population, how much activity you had in administrative sources to get into the file. We made the test more demanding, and as a result of that, deleted a whole lot of records from the file. The next thing we did was that in linking the census file to the administrative file, we were very aware of the possibility of missing links that we should have made. So we made a number of assumptions, did some mathematics about what we thought the scale of that was, and then, because clearly you don't want to miss that, you'll be double counting. They'll count both from the admin file and in the census file. So we've looked at the scale of that, and we did some, essentially did random deletion within categories to make sure that we hadn't overpopulated the file from that source. The next slide, this gives you just some idea. So the tightening up of the criteria took 120,000 people out of the file, and the random deletion for the mislinkages took 48,000 people out of the file. So we were fairly serious about being concerned about avoiding the risk of over-coverage in the file. Okay, so our file ends up looking a bit like this. The administrative data essentially fills out the non-respondents. We were able to use the administrative data for the household listing people, and that was the variables we had were sufficient to link to the administrative data, and that link rate was about 84%. And we were able to pull the variables through into the main file. So I'm going to do two things now for the rest of the talk. The first thing I'm going to do is just show you what the impact of adding the administrative records were, just essentially who were in those administrative records that got added. And then I'm going to talk a little bit more about the variables and where we've sourced them from and what they all look like. Oh, once I get past a whole lot of information about where all that came from, here we go. Okay, so here's similar to the other set of numbers, but this time just broken down a little bit. They don't actually add to the same number as the last one, and that's due to the way we treated and sourced prisoners, I think, and the army. So there's a difference if you add up those two numbers. They don't come to 525,000 just before someone tells me that. Okay, but so there we go. We've got the census respondents, and that number we've counted on the individual or the dwelling form. We've got the administrative records that we added into the dwellings, those added to the mesh block. And then there was a group of people that we thought met our test for the population, but their address information wasn't good enough to put them into the file. So I don't want to make too much of it, but you see that it turned out we had 68,000 people in that category, and you remember that from the earlier slide, we thought we were 69,000 short of the file. So we're going to do lots more work, and we appreciate that we're not claiming it's that close. We really, really aren't. There'll be a large amount of coincidence in that, but it was at least, it sort of suggests that the file we had was in the right order of magnitude in terms of what we were trying to add in. Now, the next slide. So these are 4 categories of people, census respondents and so forth. So I'm going to show you a series of slides now, which just show, with respect to some variables, what the distribution of each of these populations are. Okay, so the first one, so this is the age distribution of males. So I hope that's reasonably clear from the key. The essential thing is that the most striking thing is the population that we didn't add is the one with the big spike. So the group, the 68,000 group that we thought should have been in the file, and it's their geographic information wasn't good enough, they're the ones that are very highly slanted towards being young, which, you know, I won't surprise anybody that the difficulties in locating people who start living their lives independently. You can see the next group, the group we added into the mesh block, it's the one that also has a bit of a slant, and then the pattern, the rest is the census file and the ones we added to the dwelling, which have a similar distribution. You see very low, not adding children. I mean, administrative data keeps track of young children pretty well. So that's the age distribution. This is the males. I'm not going to show you the males. This is the males are the most pronounced one. They're the, if you like, the most striking case. This is what ethnicity looks like. So again, this is, so for example, for the blue bars here, this is the proportion of the census respondents whose ethnicity was Maori, which you can see is about 13–14%. And as you can see, very striking here that in the administrative data, the group, the next bar, the group that we added into dwellings, where we had good enough administrative data to add people into dwellings, that group was 33% of them or so had Maori ethnicity. Same sort of picture for the Pacific, that the process of using administrative data, people of Maori ethnicity are in our administrative data sources. It's a sort of averages, so something had to be the other way around. Europeans were the other way around, they're more in the census file. Asians, a bit of a mixed pattern. Again, though, there's the group not added. Remember how young the group not added are. So how that played out in terms of the age distribution. There's, so this is the DSE, so that's what I introduced very early on. That's our best estimate of what we think the population distribution should be like, the sort of gold line across the top. And this is the compared to the census distribution that we've actually got in the file. Okay, so this is an attempt to try and look at how the geographic coverage of 2018 census file compares in terms of coverage terms compared to 2013. So but it's not an apples with apples comparison. I've got to be careful to say that. The 23 numbers that are in that sort of more goldy colour are the 2013 census counts against the final numbers that we took once we'd done the post-enumeration survey and we'd published the final estimated resident population file. The 2018 numbers are our current counts against our current best estimate, which of course will be revised by the time we've done all the assessment. So the main feature of this one is that while this predominantly with the lower level, because the coverage in a counted sense is better with the 2018 file, that generally the 2018 geographic coverage is more even. And in particular, as you can see, the use of administrative data has had a big impact in the far north. So that's, far north, Whangarei and Kaipara, there's a differential under coverage that's been a big feature of censuses with our problems there, has been mitigated to some extent by the use of administrative data for populations. Okay, so now I'm going to go and do what I said and talk a little bit about the variables. So for a while now, we've been releasing pictures like this. This talks about the essentially the coverage error and the alignment of the concept, comparing questions we asked on the actual census form itself with available administrative data. So now essentially if you're in the, so where things there are good substitutes for administrative data is the top right hand corner of this picture. So you can see things like income are there, tax related. Bottom left hand corner at the other extreme are things where we don't have any administrative data at all. So there's a lot of things in there that are to do with your perceptions of the damp and cold of your house, personal experience of the limitations of physical limitations of any disability that you might have. The red circle around a variable means that we thought we've taken it into the 2018 census file where we've taken administrative records in. So this is the sort of information that we're been producing. There's a lot of this sort of documentation around and being produced. So this is a sourcing diagram. So what we've got here is where the variables in the file have been sourced from. So you can see the key there, we've got access to the previous census. So there's light green's the current census, dark green's the previous census, the blue's the administrative data. Now, imputation. Now, we said, and I feel June's eagle eyes upon me, that we'd said before we started the census that we're going to make more use of item imputation. Traditionally, we haven't done very much of that. And so that was always part of our plans for the 2018 census. The sort of brick colour at the bottom is where there was no information that wasn't good enough. Now, just by way of comparison, I've got a line here. So because we didn't use imputation in previous censuses and didn't have the administrative data in the previous census forms available, that just sort of gives you, between the two dotted lines there, that's the sort of item non-response that we would have had in the 2013 census file. So it just gives you an idea of what essentially that would have been orange. Now, this isn't all the variables, it's a selection of them. So just to be clear, what I'm going to show you now, these are the worst cases. This is the variables where we really couldn't find anything else to do. So you would have, back on the 29th of April, when we announced the 23rd of September release date, we said at that point that we weren't going to be able to release iwi affiliation data. It simply wasn't good enough. I know people who would, many of you will know more about this than I, but in between censuses, we revised the iwi affiliation, and the number of iwi went from something like 70 to about 110 or something of that magnitude. So it meant that there was the 2013 census, even the coding file that underpinned the 2013 census wasn't so useful for trying to look at iwi and source iwi affiliation for 2018. Oh, so yes, so I'm just going to sort of some wrap up stuff now. The business case for the 2023 census. So this has been one of the because we've been late by with the 2018 census, it's now time to put in the bid for the 2023 census. So we're busily trying to juggle doing this at the same time, which has obviously required us to do to take stock of lessons learnt fairly quickly. In this context, so then there's the two panel reports that I mentioned earlier on. So the External Data Quality Review panel was released on Monday. They've got to do, this is their first report. They're going to do a more detailed report on, and more looking through all the variables. So this is a very brief summary of that report in terms of the things that were highlighted in their media release, which you can see there. Essentially, they described the methodologies that we did as appropriate, and they went through, where we'd sourced them all and how we'd done them. They confirmed most of our quality ratings, so we give each variable a quality rating and talk about how we did it, and they confirmed the quality ratings we'd given the variables consistent that we used in the electoral system. They disagreed with our rating of ethnicity. That was because while we'd shown that we could get people into the top level categories, the top of the classification, distinguishing Maori from Pacific from European and so forth, they put a lot more emphasis on the fact that we're not, with the administrative data, well able to distinguish Niueans from Tokelauans from Samoans, and that. So they considered that we rated it as good and they rated it as moderate. So that was that disagreement's documented. And they expressed concern about the social and cultural license to use administrative data in the way they had. They essentially said, well, given the situation and the choice and the options you had, we understand what you did, but we think there needs to be a lot more further discussion about using administrative data in this way and this purpose. Earlier on, August 13th, we also, you can read if you're interested, the report on the governance and operation of the 2018 census. So this is the document that talks about what caused the problem in the first place, what went wrong. As I say, I've got a few bullet points out there, and if you want me to tell you more of that story, I'm perfectly happy to, from my perspective and the perspective of the reviewers. As I've noted there, that while they said there was, essentially it's sort of worth remembering that the online form, a lot of people said, well, you learned a lot about doing online forms, didn't you? But it was, in fact, that part of the census worked very well and exceeded the expectations and the targets we'd set for it. But we really didn't get and follow that up with being ready with enough paper and enough people on the ground to make people who wanted to fill in the forms in other ways, we didn't make it easy enough for them and get enough to them early enough. And then once we got into a difficult situation, we, under pressure, we probably made some decisions that made our situation worse. But anyway, if you want me to ask me more about that, I'm perfectly happy to answer questions. Here we go.
Thank you, Vince. That was great. It's so nice to see some data finally coming out from 2018 census. Can you help me thank Vince for presentation, please? We've got about 5 minutes for some questions, so there will be some microphones going around. Please remember to not speak until you've got the microphone, because otherwise people online can't hear. For the people watching online, if you want to ask a question, you can type it in the little dialogue box there and Maddie will ask it for you.
Yeah, hi. I attended a couple of the population conferences around 5 years ago when Stats New Zealand gave presentations on alternative forms of the census. And there was clearly considerable government pressure to make the census cheaper. And there was a discussion at the first of these papers I attended to about what were cheaper alternatives. My first question is, when we talk about the outcomes of the census, was it cheaper, and how much of what took place in fact related to pressure to make it cheaper? My second question is about the cultural agreement from New Zealanders for their administrative data to be used. I mean, there's already the IDI, and I know that sitting in a room full of health researchers and how enormously helpful the IDI is, but there's certainly no question that the New Zealand public have been asked for permission for their data to be used in this way. At what point do you think this might come back and bite us all in the backside in terms of New Zealanders maybe being less willing to offer their data?
Okay, so it's always a little, the comparing cost of censuses one to another, of course, things tend to cost more over time. So this was, you know, comparing it to previous censuses, I think we in the end did spend roughly about the $120 million that we were going to on the census. The review report, the one of those reports there, in it, it says that that the budget wasn't finally the biggest problem, that we should have been able to manage a comparable response rate within the budget that we had. That was the conclusion of those reviewers. You know, the essence of the model this time was obviously that we tried to get people who are willing to respond online and then dedicate resources to trying to follow up with everybody else. And essentially, we didn't really, what happened was that we just didn't get out. You get momentum with the census on census day. And we just didn't get enough people out to take advantage of that momentum. And then we had to spend money later on trying to catch that up. And essentially that's very, very difficult once that profile has dissipated after census day. So it's certainly the question of what to do next about social license is one that has been addressed to Liz quite a lot when she's been asked about it. The things that she talks about when she's asked about that is that it's quite hard to find ways I mean, she has looked at various avenues of trying to have this conversation. One of the advantages in some ways of having so much profile around the 2018 census is it sort of created the interest that enables maybe us that we can have that sort of population. Certainly in the run up to the publication of the results, we've been very connected to iwi, and we've been doing a lot of work with iwi up and down the country, and talk to them about the what mitigations and how the role administrative data will play in the next census. But it's still an ongoing thing. Oh, here we go.
Got a question from online. Do you think there are positive things that have come out of combining admin with census data?
Well, I mean, there's at the level of our capacity to cover the population, as I mentioned, just going through the some of those results, the improvement in the coverage of the areas in the far north through administrative data, that will result in them being represented in a way that they haven't been in previous census files. It's getting, I have to say that while we didn't get the response that we should have got in the census, we clearly Stats New Zealand is the continuously in the field trying to collect the labour force survey, which is 40% or so, is nearly 1% of the population that we collect every quarter. And so we sort of know how much harder it was getting. I was talking to the staff who run the labour force survey. 10 years ago, we had a three knock rule on a house, which was basically, you know, 3 knocks on a door was enough to get a response, and much more than that you weren't going to get a response. So now the average is 6, and in harder to get areas it takes 8 mostly, and that's to maintain a level of response that doesn't match the response that we used to have. It's people are not so keen to respond anymore, and that's a factor.
It's very interesting. It's sometimes said in wartime, technology gets improved through crisis. Did this happen to you?
Technology, well, look, I'd have to say that it sharpened our ability. So we've been doing the work with looking at how to use administrative data, creating an administrative file to monitor the population. But the whole business of actually how to combine the census file and administrative data together to get the best synthesis of the two of them, that was something that we've learnt in a very accelerated circumstances. And we've got some further work that we'll hopefully be releasing about March next year, where that's been done in parallel to this, which will add further insight into that within your life.
Okay. Thank you again, Vince, for a great talk. Can you help me thank Vince?